Hi everyone, welcome to an addendum to my free trade lecture. And so today, just a small point I want to make about tariffs and inflation. Sometimes people think that, hey, if we have a 20% tariff, that means 20% inflation, and that is not necessarily the case. And then I thought I'd also summarize our discussion on free trade from a pros and cons perspective. And so the first question is, well, what is a US tariff, in particular on imports? Well, a tariff is nothing more than a tax simply because a good crosses a border. In this case, a US firm is importing a good. An example might be Godiva, a Belgian chocolate company. They want to export chocolate to the United States, and let's say they want $10 for their chocolate, and there's a 20% tariff. Well, the US importer, they're the ones that technically owe the money, would owe a $2 tariff to the US government. So the question is, does this necessarily mean that the price of chocolate to the US consumer will be raised by 20%? And the answer is no. At the end of the day, Godiva, they understand about the tariff and they understand that the US consumer will owe $2. And so for them, it's a pricing decision. It may not be in their best interest to raise prices or to have the consumer have to pay a 20% additional price. And so they may pick up some of the price of the tariff or maybe all of it, even by shipping it DDP, which is something that stands for delivery duty paid. So if you're the Belgian exporter, what would make it more likely that you'd be willing to pay the tariff or to ship it DDP? Well, what if you had, and I'm making this up, 70% profit margins? And what if you also thought, well, hey, you know what? If the American consumer has to pay 20% more for this chocolate, maybe they'll buy their chocolate from Hershey instead. And so if that's the case, then they might say, well, you know what, we'll pay all of the tariff. Or maybe we'll just pay some of the tariff. And so at the end of the day, yes, that tariff has to be paid. And technically it's by the US importer, but it might be shared between the supplier, any middleman, and the end consumer. And that is why a 20% US tariff on a particular good does not necessarily mean that prices for that good will go up by 20%. So let's summarize, if you will, the pros and cons of our free trade discussion. Well, presumably, even though it may be financially beneficial and so on and so forth, some trade should not be free simply for national security reasons. So maybe AI chips, okay? Maybe the United States decides, no, we have to have at least some AI chips made in this country, otherwise there's too much of a national security threat. And so even if it would be beneficial financially to have somebody else make those AI chips, we're going to make them in this country. So subject to that constraint, if you believe the markets on average do a better job of allocating limited resources than the government does, then freer trade appears to on average benefit consumers with a higher standard of living, but employees lose their jobs. Well, think about it from this perspective. We just had a benefit for a consumer, and employees may lose their jobs, and so there are trade-offs, but people are often both at the same time. In fact, typically they are. Employees are consumers, and consumers are employees. So who should get priority? Well, one way to think about this is if companies and employees get priority, and I know it's not an all an on-off button, this is simply from a broad perspective. But if companies/employees get priority because they're protected from the markets, then what that means is, hey, we're protected, and you, the consumers, you'll need to buy whatever services or products we provide. And what's the other end of the spectrum? The other end of the spectrum is, hey, consumers get priority. And companies and employees, you have to compete for consumer wants and needs. And the companies may fail, in which case they go under, employees lose jobs, and so on and so forth, or they may succeed. And so that seems to be, at least from a very big picture perspective, and I agree it's simplistic, that seems to be the broad trade-off and the question to ask between those two ends of the spectrum. Should companies and employees get priority, or should consumers get priority? Anyway, I hope this was helpful and wish you all the best.